Referred to by Yiyun Li as one of the most unique voices in American literature, Hanna Pylväinen is the author of the Whiting Award-winning debut novel We Sinners, the story of a devout but fragmented Midwestern family. She teaches at Warren Wilson College's MFA writing program. Her new novel, The End of Drum Time, is an epic love story about a young reindeer herder and a minister's daughter in the 19th century Arctic Circle. Paul Harding won the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for Tinkers, in which a dying elderly man wanders through the rooms of his life's large and quiet moments. The director of the MFA in Creative Writing and Literature at Stony Brook University, he is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. His new novel, This Other Eden, tells the multi-generational story of an isolated island community off the coast of Maine. Please join me in first welcoming Hanna Pylväinen to the stage.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here, and I'm really excited to read with Paul. It's a terrific honor. I'm going to read just a bit from a scene early on in the book. There's not that much you need to know besides Willa is the daughter of a minister, and Ivar is a reindeer herder with whom she has fallen in love. The gray tail of winter, always much longer than anyone wished, was moving everyone, human and wolverine, into restlessness. They were in the strange stage now of full sun and full snow, where the sky said summer and the ground said winter, and the backs of everyone's eyes hurt from seeing so much sun coming off of so much snow, and people skied as much as they could with their eyes mostly closed. The Sami were waiting for Easter to leave with the herds, and the settlers were waiting for the Sami to leave because it meant the snow would melt and they would see, briefly, something green again. But in the meantime, winter persisted. It was very good at overstaying its welcome, and only Willa did not want it to end because once it ended, her chance of seeing Ivar was gone. For 5-6 months at least, she wouldn't see him while he was with the herd at the sea. Idiotic, of course, to still be thinking about him. When Ivar had said that about how he'd thought she was a good little church girl, she'd felt the first real wave of shame for pining after him, ashamed for the fact of their bodies between them. She'd been betrayed by her own body, and she was being betrayed by it now. She thought about him more than ever. It occurred to her she was being humbled, brought low by him. She could not make it through the Lord's Prayer without landing on the word temptation and thinking what a nice word it was, temptation, and then thinking how nice it would be to be led into temptation, to have temptation take her by the hand and take her out to the tents, to the sidas. Every day she saw more and more that she was unfit and unclean and not heaven acceptable. And then these doubts and failings began to multiply, double in front of her like smallpox. She had been so used to thinking that there was God and there was her father and there was the church and that these would always be uppermost in her mind, but now they were nowhere. They were little nothings. The real miracle of the world was the ability of the body to set aside the soul. Now her father's warning seemed much more sensible. This was her trial, and as he'd warned, she did not have the faith for it. She was happy, eager even, to take up league with anyone or anything, if that anyone or anything brought her to Ivar. Worse, it was just how he'd warned. Everything about church, about God, began to bother her, so that even the mention of Jesus Christ irritated her, and her father's followers irritated her, mystified her, so that one day she found herself wondering what these people were doing on the cabin floor. The woman with the little boy, why was she here? Why was she crying so hard and saying she was so full of sin? Where was her husband? Why did she grab her little boy and try to make him be awakened too? The second time Maria rolled on the floor, she lay there for a long time, very still, and Willa thought, some discomfort roiling up from somewhere, get up. Why did she think that? Because she didn't want her own sins absolved? Everyone must be a sinner like her? Her heart was jumpy all the time. She went out to the field and looked at the frozen ground, kicked the snow away, tugged half-heartedly at the frozen wheelbarrow, but it didn't move. And she crossed the river into Finland, and she went out to see if any ptarmigan were there, or rather, to see if Ivar was there. She liked to imagine that even though the last conversation had ended so awkwardly, he would return to it, that the power of their attraction to each other and the power of an inevitability between them would keep bringing them here. She reached the first trap and almost didn't look at it, since it was hardly her real purpose at all, when she saw she had caught a ptarmigan. It was a male, and its feathers had not changed into its summer browns yet. Up close, she saw it was still alive. It thrashed. She was surprised it had been caught at all. She leaned in and tried to grab it by the neck, but it was beating its wings, and its feathers were coming off all around her, like the bird was snowing. And she tried again to grab it, and it bit her mitten, pulling off a bit of wool in its mouth. She stood up, and then she knew. She could feel him behind her, and a spot she could not identify, maybe to the right of her heart, coursed and opened. He stopped near her with his soft, expert skidding. She felt her hands tremble, and her skin pricked along her neck and down her back. What absurdity, what an idiot she was. She felt her smile stuck on her face. She couldn't stop it. "I thought you were angry at me," he said. "I am," she lied. "But I've been practicing," he said. "Practicing what?" "Being charming and handsome," he said. "Really," she said, "what for?" "So you will think I am charming and handsome." She said, "I'd rather you be useful." "What should I do to be useful?" "You can kill this poor ptarmigan," she said, and he dropped his ski pole and went near the trap. He leaned over and held one hand out steady, and the ptarmigan fluttered and squalled, and he caught its chest in his hand, and then took his other hand and turned its head on its neck. There was the popping sound of its bones, and then it was quiet. He freed its claws from the snare and handed it to her. Its eyes were open. "How do the Finns make ptarmigan soup?" he asked. "How?" she asked, not understanding the question. "Well," he said, "first they get some vodka." "Okay," she said warily. "Then they pour in a little vodka into the pot, and they heat that up. Then they add some more vodka and taste it, see if it's okay. Then they drink it, and that's how they make ptarmigan soup." "Do you enjoy ptarmigan soup?" she asked. "It's my favorite," he said solemnly. "Yes, I was afraid of that. I saw you that way on the hill." "Oh," he said, "yes, yes." He didn't look embarrassed at all. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I was checking the traps." "Let's go then," he said, and he started to ski, leading the way like he was showing her her own route. "Aren't you coming?" "You're going too fast," she said, which wasn't completely true. She wanted him to slow down to ski next to her, and as if the day were all dream, he did slow down, and she caught up next to him, and they skied side by side. She looked at him and grinned, and he grinned. "Tell me a story," she said. "About what?" "About the people who live underground." "You like my strange stories." "I do." "How come?" She hesitated. "Maybe," she said, "because of the Old Testament." "Well, this story is much, much older than the Old Testament." "The Older Testament," she said. "Yes," he said, seeming pleased with this, "the much older Testament." "Well," he said, "once a man was driving his sledges. He was with his family, his wife and his 2 daughters. They were traveling, in fact," he said, his eyebrow raising meaningfully, "to go to church. All of a sudden, the reindeer didn't want to go any further. Finally, he climbed out of the sled to see what was wrong. He went to the front of the string, but there wasn't anything wrong. He didn't know why, but he felt strange or sick." Ivar stopped, clearly for dramatic effect. "Go on," Willis said. "Well," Ivar said, "the man suddenly realizes in front of him is an eparas, an epera. You know what it is?" "No," Willa lied. "It's the spirit of a baby that a mother has abandoned. But when they die without being named, they come back, and they are very bad. Everyone is very afraid of them. So the man shouted to the spirit to go away, and suddenly the reindeer were quiet. And at the back of the sledges, the dogs were barking, and his wife was shouting. He went to where his eldest daughter had been sitting, and she was dead, a shoe band tight around her neck." Willa looked at him. "It's an old story," he added at last. Next time, he said, I'll tell you one with a happier ending, the one about the stalu who eats his grandchild. It's all the same story, he went on. First, we are flowers, and then we die. He laughed, but it was not a bitter laugh. It was a laugh that contained death calmly. They were at the next trap, but it was empty. Of course it was empty. There was only one more to check. Willa could feel again how short this would be, could already see him hurrying away home, and she felt maddened by it. But why was the daughter dead? She asked. You don't see? I just want to understand. Yes, he said, that's the outlander way, always wanting to understand, always wanting to know the reason for things. I guess I don't have to know, she said. No, he said, although I guess it depends. It depends, she said, frustrated. She let herself show it. Everything always depends, she said in imitation. That's true, he said, it does. What does it depend on, she asked, no longer sure what the conversation meant, what they were really talking about or not talking about, love or God or the ptarmigan dead on the sled. The weather, he said, probably the weather, and he winked at her. When he winked at her, she was forced to face again his handsomeness. It overwhelmed her, the wedge of his cheeks, the even line of his teeth. She wanted to kiss him. She wanted to bear his children. She wanted to make a mistake, a good and large mistake. She wanted him to be worth a tragedy. The next trap is empty, he said. Yes, she said, probably. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with all of you tonight, and wonderful to hear Hanna read from her incredibly fantastic book. I'm going to continue the Old Testament theme for the evening. One thing, I was just thinking that I haven't been to Philadelphia in a long time. I used to, for years, I was in kind of like a third-rate rock band, and I always like to remember the places that I used to play in the different cities I go to as an author now. So it's been many, many years, but we played 2 or 3 times anyways in Philly at the Khyber Pass. I don't know if that's the old, So that was. I probably have great memories of playing there, but they're not. Well, whatever. I was a drummer in a rock band. I don't remember much of that. I'm going to read just a few pages from the beginning of this other Eden. It's a novel about it's a fictionalized version of a racially integrated settlement or community that's on a small island off the southern coast of Maine. And what I'm going to read to you is just from the beginning. It is a kind of, what I'm going to read is actually nested within the context of the sort of matriarch or grandmother in the family of this family is retelling, kind of almost doing this ritualized retelling of a local flood that the island and their ancestors had lived through about 100 years before the main action of the story. So it's deliberately told in a kind of Old Testament kind of Sturm und Drang, and it's sort of a tall tale. So it's just kind of a rip-roaring bunch of, hurricane stuff. So I don't think you need to know anything besides that. A hurricane struck in September of 1815, 22 years after Benjamin and Patience Honey had come to the island and begun the settlement, by which time there were nearly 30 people living there, in 5 or 6 houses, including the first Proverbs and Lark folks, the ones from Angola and Cape Verde, the others from Edinburgh, Patience herself from Galway, Ireland, originally, before she met Benjamin on his way through Nova Scotia and went with him, and 3 Penobscot women, sisters who'd lost their parents when they were little girls. A surge of seawater, 20 feet high, funneled up the bay, sweeping houses and ships along with it. When the wall of ocean hit, it tore half the trees and all the houses off the island, guzzling everything down, along with 2 honeys, 3 Proverbs, 1 of the Penobscot sisters, 3 dogs, 6 cats, and a goat named Enoch. The hurricane roared so loudly, Patience Honey thought she'd gone deaf at first. That is, until she heard the tidal mountain avalanching toward them, bristling with houses and ships, trees and people and cows and horses churning inside it, screaming and bursting and lowing and neighing and shattering and heading right for the island. Then she knew all might well be lost, that this might well be the judgment of exaltation, the sealed message unsealing, that after they'd all been swept away by the broom of extermination, there'd be so few trees left standing, a young child would be able to count them up, and their folks would be scarcer than gold. But not all gone, not everyone. Patience knew. Some honeys would persist, some proverbs survive. A lark or two might endure. So for reasons she could never afterward explain, she snatched the homemade flag she'd stitched together from patches of the stars and stripes and the Portuguese crown and golden Irish harp shaped like a woman who looked so much like a figurehead and always reminded her husband of the one on the front of the ship he'd been a sailor on that had sunk off the coast and brought him to the island in the first place, and the faded, faint squares embroidered with Bantu triangles and diamonds and circles that he'd carried with him everywhere, that he showed her meant man and woman and marriage and the rising sun and the setting sun, that he always said were his great-grandfathers, although she in her heart of hearts didn't think that could be true. And she tied it like a scarf around her throat, and she took Benjamin by the hand and dragged him from their shack out into the whirlwind. She swore it was a premonition because no sooner had she and her husband passed out the door than the house broke loose from its pilings and tumbled away behind them, bouncing and breaking apart into straw like a bale of hay bouncing off a rick and into the ocean. Now that she stood in the open, facing the bedlam, her legs would not work. She was sure that this was the judgment, and what was to be was to be. It was useless to try to outrun the outstretched arm of the Lord. Benjamin roared over the roaring storm, the tree, and he pointed to the tallest tree on the island, the Penobscot pine, at the top of the bluff. Benjamin pointed and leaned his face toward his wife and pointed up the tree. Wind plastered his shirt and the rain lashed and streamed down his face and ran from his hair, and lightning broke across the sky and thunder blasted against the earth and sea, and he roared again over the roaring storm, the tree. And Patience thought of their grown children and their young grandchildren and cried to her husband, the children. And Benjamin looked beyond his wife, and there were their children and grandchildren, drenched and shouldering their way against the winds and lashing rains, the ocean rising now up to the windows of the lark's old shack and pouring into it through the broken panes, and the largest surging waves thundering nearly up to where his own house had stood not 2 minutes before, and sucking all the earth right off the very rocks and into the black and gray and brooding jade Atlantic. And he cried, "Go to the tree." And he ran toward his grown children and young grandchildren and grabbed 2 soaking little ones from their mothers and carried one each under his arms and ran toward the tree. And the wind roared and spun, and they staggered against it, now nearly blown toward the bluff, now nearly blown back away from it. When they reached the tree, one of Benjamin and Patience's sons, I think she always said it was Thomas, stood on Benjamin's shoulders, and the other sons and daughters climbed up the 2 men and reached the lowest branches of the old tree, and once they got their footing as best they could in the middle of bedlam, the others tossed the waterlogged children up to them one by one. Once Patience had climbed into the tree and Thomas followed her up from Benjamin's shoulders, Benjamin himself scaled the trunk like the mast of a ship and roared once more, as high as you can climb. And all the honeys in that old tree climbed with all their strength, the children screaming and crying, the men and women screaming and crying, until the whole soaked clan clung together and to the trunk in a trembling, grasping cluster at the top of that swaying, bending, mighty old tree, snapping back and forth in the wind like a whip. And right then they all heard a greater thunder rumble from the clamor, and the whole island quaked under them, telegraphing their extinction. And at that moment, Patience, honey, holding one of her grandbabies tight as could be against her side with one arm, and clenching the tree with the other, looked to the south, down the bay, and there she saw that piled ocean, all the trees and buildings and shrieking people and wagons and sloops and schooners churning in its saltwater guts, and an old sea captain named Burnham in his pilot coat, rowing a dinghy on the blazing crest of it all, smoking a pipe bowl down to keep the water out, crying for mad joy at this last rapturous pile-up, and all of it, that great massif of water and ruin speeding right for the honeys in their tree, which now seemed like a twig, a toothpick, a drenched blade of grass set against the immensity of that mountain range of ocean and demolition. What was always so eerie about it afterwards, Patience always said, what was so terrifying about it that made her bowels feel as if they'd turned to sand, was how quiet it all seemed, like a breath drawn and held right before it hit. How breathtakingly fast, but nearly silent and so just plain beautiful it was. All those people and trees and ships and horses cartwheeling past within the billows. It wasn't silent really, but more so loud it was too big to hear. I could not hear it for that second because it was just too big a sound for my ears to hear. The water hit the south shore of the island first and swallowed it whole and smooth. Then it hit the jagged bedrock spine running up the middle of the island and broke over it, hissing like a saw blade. When it struck the slope of the bluff, it exploded across the horizon in front of the islanders in the tree, hung up and suspended for a moment in an apocalyptic entablature that Patience afterward always said looked in that instant before it all collapsed back together and swept along, how the parted sea must have appeared to the poor Israelites. I was pretty well given up on it all, and in that tree, holding it so hard, the bark cut into my arms and gave me these scars, and holding that baby so hard against me, I thought I'd crack it, drenched to the marrow and screaming and trying not to let go. But when that tower of ocean and ruination burst apart in front of me, in a blink, but deep as my soul, I saw a broad, dry avenue running through the middle of the sea. And it was thronged with shepherds and sheep and old ladies on donkeys, litters of children curled up asleep on hay in the beds of rickety carts. The parted ocean towered on both sides, sheer, smooth, and monolithic. And inside the water, a pell-mell cavalcade of Egyptian men and horses and chariots scrolled past, tumbling heel over headdress, fetlock over cannon, bumper over shaft. Most of the men wore linen tunics, but some wore leopard skins and feathers and had elaborate headdresses. Some of them were tethered to their chariots by leather reins and held longbows. Arrows and spears twirled among the men and horses in the cars. Their black-lined eyes stared wide open, but they were all clearly drowned. And I knew what it was like when God parted the sea. And I knew that Moses was way up there at the front of the line. Not like the idea of Moses, but the man himself, the very man Moses, when God opened the ocean. Then the waters collected all the relic and rubble back up and swept over the rest of the island. The water churned and rose up the Penobscot pine laden with the honeys. Patience looked down through the branches and limbs and watched the seething waters rise over her children's and grandchildren's feet, billow up their skirts and rise over their midriffs and up their exposed throats, then into their sputtering mouths. And she watched their hair soak up the boiling waters, and she watched the waters swill Benjamin up too. And she watched her daughter, Charity Honey, wrench free from the tree and tumble away in the wreckage, clutching her baby son, David, in her arms. And the waters reached her feet, and she felt something deep down in the bottom of the tree crack and give, and the tree bowed, and she was in the swift roaring waters up to her waist. Then the tree levered itself back upright. Though it seemed not to swallow at her quite so greedily as it first had, the water still rose, and it reached Patience's collarbone, and Patience always said she could still just see the top of Benjamin's head below her in the water, serene almost becalmed, tiny bubbles of air rising from his hair. And it was then, just as the water touched it at her throat, that Patience remembered the old flag she'd sewn for Benjamin from the bits and pieces of other flags and national rags and bedraggled patches not long after they'd married and first settled their now drowning island, still tied around her neck. She always said later, I just decided right then that if we were all going to judgment, I was going to fly our little flag until the last possible second. So I hoisted that baby up even more and pressed it between the tree and my breast harder than I ever otherwise would have dared. And I freed my hand and somehow unknotted the flag from my neck and held it in my hand and held my hand up just as high as I could get it. And the wind took the flag up and snapped it and practically tore it from my grasp, but I kept hold and there it flew. Then the water rose over the baby, who'd gone past wailing and just stared, wedged between my body and the tree, dumbfounded at the pandemonium, wide-eyed and quiet as it burbled under. And the water reached my mouth and covered my face and went over my head. And still I held that foolish flag as high as I could. And the water rose up my shoulder, and the water rose up to my raised elbow, and the water rose up my forearm, and the water reached my wrist. And so there is just my one hand holding that motley little tattered flag sticking up above the surface of the flood, and the waters rose up my fingers, and just as my hand was about to disappear and that flag and all us honeys be swallowed up in the catastrophe, the water stopped rising. Stop there. Thank you.
Hiya, Paul. How was writing This Other Eden different from writing your other books? Since this did take a lot of research, did you find it to be a lot more strenuous, or did you think that having a framework with these historical elements, do you think that provided a good framework for the story?
I kind of have a quantity theory. I feel like every book I've worked on is just so much harder than anything else I've ever done. I don't know. One of the things that I think will be interesting to talk about, two of us, and our methods for writing these books, is when I found out about the historical, it's Malaga Island, the name is Malaga Island, I read maybe 2 or 3 old articles about it. I think the main one was in Down East magazine. And kind of by the end of reading those 2 or 3 articles, I knew I wanted to write a fictionalized version of something like that. I'd been working on something else that was sort of set in the same place that my second novel, Enon, was set. And the minute I realized that I wanted to write about a situation like that, I stopped doing any research at all. And partly because Malaga Island, a more historical novelization of that actual story wasn't mine to write. I didn't have any organic connection to the island. I don't know any of the descendants. So what struck me was that I came across the story of Malaga Island in just Googling sort of, it was either all black or racially integrated communities, particularly after the Civil War. And of course, just dozens, they just come up, they're everywhere, around the country. But Malaga was in Maine, and so my first novel, Tinkers, is set in Maine. One of the families on Malaga Island, when they were evicted, were actually committed to a place called the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. You can imagine. And that had been a model for an asylum that somebody is almost sent to in Tinkers. So I start these little points of contact. And then I found out that the first International Congress for Eugenics was going on almost to the week that people were, that the folks were evicted from Malaga. So I thought, I want to write about this, but I wanted to, I immediately had ideas about, the island could be like, it would be like Noah's Ark in some ways. It would be like the island in The Tempest, Shakespeare's play. It would be like the Pequod, which is the boat in Melville's Moby Dick. So I immediately had all this sort of like literary stuff I wanted to do that I did not want to subject historical, I wanted to run off and kind of do an imagined version of it. So I really didn't do any research at all.
Can I relate to that? I wanted to ask you a specific question about a moment in the book where you quote, I don't know if it's a quote, this is my question, Charles Darwin's son. Is that real?
Some of that stuff I looked at some of the the proceedings or whatever from this Congress on eugenics, and what I did was it's very grim, it's very terrible, awful stuff. But as a writer, it was interesting to paraphrase or write documents in that kind of prose, and that's just awful, arrogant, terribly kind of dehumanizing sort of. So that type of language is there, and there was something in one of the historical documents, something from the proceedings that I read. This one guy was just going on and on about Cleopatra, because Cleopatra was famously, her parents were brother and sister, and their parents were brother. All that whole family. It was just all siblings for generations and generations. And so there's something kind of weird about if we met her now, she'd clearly be regal and royal, but also a nymphomaniac, and just this weird. It's just so you just feel these people making stuff up as they're writing, but it's being done under the imprimatur of science at the time. Yeah. But you researched.
Yeah, so we're the opposite ends of the spectrum. Yeah, I spent 10 years traveling to the Arctic Circle. I wasn't there for 10 years. Over the course of 10 years, I made 7 trips north of the Arctic Circle, staying with the same family of reindeer herders, Sami reindeer herders. And then, of course, I just did a tremendous amount of other research, just, libraries and, art and museums and, So very much a different take.
It's funny though, because because I don't do research per se, I still throw every book that I'm reading, every painting that I'm looking at, early on I just throw everything in, and so my book, there are paintings and books and texts and all sorts of stuff, but all just I have fun throwing it in and seeing if I can get it to all connect. But yours. If you read Hannah's book, it's incredible, and there are just these passages where it's just you had to have. It wasn't even. You could tell that you actually were sort of outdoing that. It had such a, as they say in the workshop, is lived in. But no, it's really it's so extraordinary. Just unbelievable.
So what's really interesting when you listen to you guys read is that there's this very melodic quality in yours, Hannah, and you see the skis, you see the bird, you see the snow, you see them skiing together. There's a relationship that's developing, and you can kind of see the arc of what happened before and what's happening now and what will happen, what will come of it. And with you, it's like you're a drummer. It's just you write like you drum. And it's just all this shit, all over the place. Yeah. But, because the Egyptians aren't there. We talked about this when we talked.
Yeah.
The Egyptians aren't there. There wasn't a storm exactly like this ever in the history of the universe. But it all works, and it all just it's all piled together in this gigantic maelstrom, which is what it is. And then at the end, it's the same kind of arc, It starts here comes this thing, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and all is lost, and then the water recedes. And it's so completely different, but they're both music, Yeah,
I think, I think with reading Hannah's book, there is this astonishing sense of inevitability, and part of it is just sort of, I think with both of the kind of historical circumstances we took, it's like when you're writing anything that's sort of historical fiction, the thing is the reader knows what happens at the end. So in some ways, it disciplines you as a writer because the story has to be in the telling. It's like the Titanic sinks, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it ends up shaping the quality of suspense.
Yeah, right.
Potentially, so the end of Drum Time is very loosely based, extremely loosely, based on a real event that happened called the Kautokeno Rebellion, when a group of Sami people rose up against the Norwegian and Swedish innkeepers, and a couple of them were murdered and beaten. And kind of more interesting, if you guys can like hold this all in your head at the same time, these Sami people were followers of the religion that then 150 years later I was born into. So, so you can sort of see how I got there and made my way to the Arctic Circle, trying to sort of understand a lot of these things. But in this case, what's interesting is I know that most people don't know about the Kautokeino Rebellion. Like most people don't know, that it exists. So I think in some ways, it doesn't shape suspense the same way in the sense that someone might not know, who isn't from that place in that time. Oh, this is where it's going. There might be some kind of rebellion, or like even suspecting, some form of violence in any way. But of course I knew, and through all my drafts over the 10 years, it was like, I was having documents translated by some of the people who had been imprisoned after the rebellion for their part in it, just so I could like get a feeling and an understanding of like, why are these deeply religious people committing these acts? Like what's happening here? What's all the, so I think that the question of story, right, is like, I think the very question of storytelling itself is in both of our books, in very different ways.
Traditional folk,
Yeah.
folk or
Right. And I even thought it was
lore.
interesting, like I told a sort of very traditional Sami story about the woman who dies with a shoe band, right? You told a sort of a traditional kind of, like both in an oral sort of tradition, right? And I was always interested in Sami stories. They tend to always have this kind of ending where you're like, I did not think that was where it was going. Like every time someone tells me a Sami story, I'm like, I was not going, she's dead with a shoe band. Like it's just not where I was. Like I was 50 paces behind, And so I felt like partly as I was writing the book, I was asking myself, like, what does it even mean that I'm trying to write this story? And why am I writing this story at all? Like why write fiction? If you know that there's a true version of it, go write the true version.
Right.
Go do the research and write the true version. So maybe that's a question for you, Paul. Why, you've answered it from a practical perspective.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's partly along the lines of you already know what the plot is, or it's if you know the history, but also in any event, I am just always interested in the experience of the events. So I'm interested in the human experience of what it was like for this person to go through what might be a familiar episode through history, because then that way that if you find good characters that are discover their inner lives and it's rich enough, then even the most familiar kind of plots from history or whatever refract through them in ways that then are revelatory. They sort of open something up. You discover something about what is familiar, but if you're lucky, it's inexhaustible. So there's something new worth seeing or pondering. Then with the music thing, that's definitely as a drummer, and that was partly it's just when you're a writer, you want to have fun when you're writing. Write very somber stuff, but on a day-to-day, it's just like I want to be writing sentences that I think are cool and that have words in them that I think are cool. So one of the things I just wanted to do was I just wanted to see if I could write like a 10-page, tour de force, nonstop, just wave, just going for 10 pages, and you think that's going to be really hard because it's all the same way. So you keep trying to, and so I just had fun trying to do that, and it did. It kind of came out like a Keith Moon drum solo or something like that. But then I also had since there's the Old Testament, I was thinking it's like Noah, it's just like the flood in Genesis, and all of that. So one of the things, and you have a lot of passages like this. We were sort of talking about this earlier, but. In that passage that I read, it's a figure of writing or a figure of speech that's used in the Bible. It's called anaphora, which is when every sentence begins with the same word. And often enough, it's just and. And they climbed the tree, and the tree swayed, and the wave cameth. That sort of thing. And so just working with that and seeing if you could get that kind of that kind of rhythmic, that kind of musical, kind of incantatory sort of rhythm.
Yeah, and exactly the same for me. I mean, I always think of, and it came to pass in those days, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed.
Right.
Which is like, when you think about it in kind of like a traditional writing class, everyone would be like, please do not start your sentence with and, right? I mean, that's like a pretty foundational rule.
Right.
But you and I are both people who, not necessarily even about beginning with and, but we love the word and.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny, but I think it is, like, I know that I'm very drawn to cadence. Like, I read everything out loud that I write multiple times. I will actually record it and then listen to it so I can
incredible.
hear what's wrong. It's like, that's how I know when it's wrong, is when I hear it, almost rather than when I see it.
Yeah, I have the same sort of thing, and it's very intuitive, very improvisational at the beginning, and I sort of, like having been a drummer, I sort of have a sense of how many beats, or what time signature something is in, and what the tempo is, and how I slow it down. Dynamics, play softer, loud, and faster, slow, and kind of just move tempo around with that, with the so the rhythm of the words. Anybody else interested in?
Or Paul and I are very chatty.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. But we'd love to hear, there's...
Okay. So my question is about the character of Willa. I thought she was really fascinating, and I was wondering how much of you is in Willa, because she was like this outsider coming into the Sami space, but then also this girl going through this rejection of her religion. And I just was wondering, like, about your experiences as an outsider in the Sami culture, and then also your experiences growing up in this religious church, and how much of that influenced her character.
Yeah, so I would definitely say Willa is the character who's closest to me in terms of her experience with the Sami culture. So a lot of her experiences when she's hanging out with the reindeer herders is like realizing all the things she's doing wrong. And anytime you see that, it's something I did wrong. Like every single thing, So it's like, oh, you didn't put the tea kettle the right way, so the luck, you ruined all the luck. I mean, you feel really bad when you do that, but you didn't know which way the tea kettle should go. Like, you didn't know,
So that was you who didn't put the reindeers in the right order in the harnesses?
Like you name it, I did it all wrong. You know what I mean? It was just, and so I think part of that experience of sort of wanting to be helpful or useful, wanting to not be a burden to these people who are very generously taking me out to the herds, and having this sense of like, I am a burden, I am literal dead weight. It's just, they're dragging me along. I think one of the most exciting experiences of my life was this book had already, been sold, whatever, and I was there at the corral at the fence, and I was helping them with the reindeer, and my friend's father said to me, he said, "Can you come back tomorrow?" And I was like, I've done it. I'm useful. It's only taken 10 years, So I think that part of that experience, and I think a relationship, the relationship of one culture to another, which is like something I'm so interested in, and Paul, you haven't talked about yet either. Also, the burden of literature when it comes to the question of representation. And so Willa became sort of my way to talk and think about what does it mean to sort of have good intent in a kind of, stereotypically white way, and to sort of realize, your own limitations, right? What it is you know and what you don't know. So I felt in that way she was a very useful vehicle for me as a kind of, and a sort of, you guys may have noticed just in narratives, right? Like, the stranger to a new land is a very common tactic to introduce people to strange lands, right? And when I was first working on the book, I would constantly think to myself, how do I get the reindeer inside the lavu? And the lavu is it looks like we might think of it as like a teepee, right? But I would think, how do I get them in there so that it feels like home? It doesn't feel like a strange space, right? And Willa became one of those ways. To try and get there. And then it's also true, of course, that in my first book, We Sinners, which was about my own family's history, being raised in this, very conservative religion. I think as writers, and Paul, I think in some ways you were touching on this, was saying like, oh, I'm like writing about Maine again, and I'm writing about this like, remote community again, and oh, here I am, I mean, we're obsessive people. Like we just cannot stop talking and thinking about the same things, but it's almost like every time I'm like, but now I'm going to do it in a much more interesting way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this book took me something like 10 years to finish for various reasons, but I had entire years where I was just thinking, I'm just writing Tinker's Island, and you realize, you sort of, you go over the same, but then you think of your favorite authors, like William Faulkner, right? Oh, another dispossessed son of the South who's obsessed with his sister's virginity, and you go, good, another one? Great, so you just have to, one of the things I always tell my students is, don't write your books for the people who won't like them, right? And just go in, and in my case, probably in your case too, I realized that I couldn't avoid it, because then you would feel the strain of trying not to go over similar territory. So I just felt like I went through it and kind of came, kind of got through everything that was sort of similar. And at most, and some of the similarities are, they're there, but they're deeper, and then often you pursue things that are alike in order to actually ultimately find where they differentiate and become different and distinct.
But I will add on that note because, and I wonder if you feel this way, Paul, but I always think, the End of Drum Time has a larger cast of characters, I would say, and so does yours. And that's always interesting to write because you often end up writing people who are quite different from yourself. But I always find that I'm most successful with characters when I give them attributes that I understand, that I am sympathetic to, that is a part of me. And my characters fail the most when they aren't somehow some facet of me somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, because I can't think of a character that I don't. Everybody has something that in which I'm interested or something, and a lot of times it's like, you build the pearl around that little bit that you start with. Okay, I don't know anything about, so for example, at this woman Esther Honey, who's the kind of matriarch in this other Eden, and so I just decided that her dad had taught her to read, and that she had a great love of Shakespeare. So she and I could almost think about, King Lear, and trying to think up. That's just because trying to think up cool things for her to say about King Lear. I remember coming up with the lines, poor Lear, his hard old heart only softened in the breaking. And I was like, she gets that. I'm not going to put that in anything else. She gets that cool line. You come up with one, and like, okay, now she trusts me and I trust her, and you slowly, it just builds up. But that's why it takes years too, because I didn't go to the Arctic Circle. I didn't go to the island, but you do. For the 10 years that I was writing this, I lived with those imagined people until I.
And I'm wondering if you shared this experience too. So when I would sit down to write, I would feel like in order to sit down and kind of have a good writing day, I had to travel there.
Yeah.
In my mind, obviously, but it was like, okay, well, how do I get there? I'm so far away. Like I'm wherever it was I was writing it, and I wrote it in Virginia, and I wrote it in New York City, and I wrote it in Provincetown, and I wrote it in my friend's mom's house. I mean, you name it. And so every time the challenge is, how do you get there again?
Yeah. I mean, without exaggeration, wrote most of this book on Post-it notes.
Wow.
And just on a plane, and so in one sense, I just feel like I never stop writing. I'm always writing, sometimes typing, But also, I mean, I literally have this metaphor where it's almost visualization, where I think of there's a big trap door, the big ring, and I open it up, and there's a ladder, and I go down into the world of the book. And close it down, and so that when I'm in, that's also part and parcel of the way to get to know the characters and the story and the language and everything is, the discipline of learning how to pay attention and there can't be any distractions. You have to be able to just go to that place and just whatever is around you sort of disappears. And that's a real, actual practical skill that you have to. I found that I had to deliberately
it's like
work
it's a
on.
muscle.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
And when you don't write for a while, you lose it. It's awful. And then you have to go back and train again at the gym.
And cry a lot.
Yeah. You're completely weak. You're doing like a 2-pounder and crying.
I'm glad you brought up, Tinkers has been one of my favorite books since college. I've been out of college for a while. But I read it not too long after I read As I Lay Dying, and it's been a while since I read both. But there was a name in Tinkers that was also in As I Lay Dying, so I wanted to ask for 10 years now. Was As I Lay Dying at all an influence on Tinkers?
Absolutely not. Yes, no, yeah, it was. It absolutely, yes. I mean, this is one of the things about influence is that I feel like it's the privilege of influence and it's the luxury of influence, and I throw every book that I love right into my books. And then that's just a challenge. It's a fun challenge, which is taking these traditions with which you want to align yourself. I want my books to be recognizably in the tradition of Marilyn Robinson and Toni Morrison and Faulkner and Emily Dickinson and those are all my aunties and uncles, and so then the trick is just to make it so that your writing is you're availing yourself of those idioms and those traditions, but you're not just imitating them. It's not just derivative. You've somehow imbued them enough so that you work on having kind of your own voice, your own vision, but again, making those things out of familiar constituent parts. So definitely, As I Lay Dying also was a real, when I started writing books, I was really absolutely under the spell of the so-called magical realists. Realism is such a stupid term because it's like, who's realism? But I loved the Mexican novelist named Carlos Fuentes, who wrote a book called The Death of Artemio Cruz, which is sort of his homage to As I Lay Dying. And I was thinking of those two books. But also I love the fact that Fuentes in his novel Terra Nostra uses characters from 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and they both use characters from Julio Cortázar's novel Hopscotch. And I just like, you can do that? Like different characters and different, I just thought that's the coolest thing in the world. Everybody's sort of like working, any given book is like a chapter in the novel with a capital N. And I was like, I want to write one of those chapters, So yeah, absolutely.
I have a question, I guess for both of you, but Hanna, your piece made me think of it. The idea of the older Testament, or the, awesome. And I was just thinking about this sense of time, that there's sort of the distant time, and then there's the fact that this is occurring not that long ago, that you're able to read accounts of the people who were jailed, that you're, and that their voices feel like now and feel accessible, and just how you mediated those different timescapes, I guess, in this writing.
Oh man, it's a tough question because it was so tough to do, and I hesitate to say I mediated these times well, but one of the things I have been thinking about is I'm writing about a time and a place that is not going to be super familiar. There's going to be a lot of geopolitics that people aren't going to know about, and at the same time are important and essential to the plot. And so over the different drafts, I was really trying to look at form and structure to see, can I solve this with form and structure? And so at first you kind of have that thing where your characters are talking and you're just like info dumping in dialogue and like, hey, so the king, blah, 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 and you're like, okay, this is bad. And then you're like, but I really got to find a way to tell people that like Norway and Sweden used to be a united kingdom. Like, did anyone here know that Norway and Sweden used to be in a united kingdom? Like, probably not. And I wouldn't blame you, but they did. And they did at the time of my novel. So how do you solve that, right? Like, you're really stuck, because if you're living there at the time, you're not going to say to somebody, gee, did you know that Norway and Sweden are we're living in a united country right now.
Yes, that's right, Hannah.
Yes, and the king's name is Oscar the First.
Indeed.
Indeed, and the Tsar of Russia is, we're enemies with him. You know that, right? Okay, so you get in these huge problems. And so I'm trying to solve it all of these different ways. And I think in a lot of ways, the novel solved itself essentially when I started writing in omniscience. And when I began to write in omniscience and just using a narrator who already has the freedom to tell and has the freedom to say, hey, here's what's happening, right? Then it was almost like a relief because I had done all this research and I knew so much. And it was almost like I just finally let myself tell what I already knew. Instead of trying to like come up with some clever way to do it. Then at the same time, though, you reach these moments where there's things you do not know and you cannot know. And I was thinking about your question about like influences, and I remember like Jose Saramago solved a major problem for me in my book. He has this amazing moment in the Gospel According to Jesus Christ, where he writes this incredibly heretical, blasphemous version of the conception of Jesus Christ, where it makes it like very clear that it was in no way immaculate. And he's just like, and his omniscient narrator is like, like God can't always be there. Like God can't like know everything. And so I was like, wow, he's just going to announce the limits of his own omniscience. That's what you do. You just announce that you don't know everything, right? And that became like a sort of tactic that I began to use, which was like, rather than be coy one way or another, to actually just like use narrative. This is what kind of goes back to what I was talking about, like storytelling, to point out, hey, I'm telling a story. I am a storyteller. I'm part of a storytelling tradition. This is my story right here. But please remember, it's a story. Yeah. And I too have researched a lot. I know a lot. Reindeer always run counterclockwise in a circle. Any fun facts you want to know, I'm full of them. But there's a lot that no matter how much time I spend there, I can't know.
Right. Yeah. I would just add that's one of the things that was the most freeing about one of the most freeing things I discovered as a writer is that you don't have to know, you don't have to understand. To know something doesn't mean you understand it. And to describe something doesn't mean that you've explained it. You don't have to explain anything. In fact, if you're writing about like these deepest mysteries of who we are in the cosmos and all that stuff, you've brought your reader into a realm where explanation's actually not available.
Yeah.
And so it becomes just a matter of description, just describing characters' experiences.
And kind of just connecting all of this back, I remember at one point, when I was hanging out with my reindeer herding friends, and I was expressing to them, like, this fear, right? I'm going to get this all wrong. Like, I know I'm going to get this wrong. I'm going to get all these details wrong. Why am I doing this? I'm like, this is so dumb. Like, why do people make up stories? Like, just stop making them up. Like, you have real ones, tell a real one. And I thought, I've done so much research at this point. I could write, a biography of this minister. I could write, I don't even, blah, blah, blah. And I'm expressing this anxiety, and my friend looks at me, and she just says, well, Hannah, you're writing a novel because you're a writer. She said, if you were a painter, you would paint it. And if you sang, you would sing it. But you're a writer, so you're writing it.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.